Stay tuned for Jett, Rink, and Mike Yon, the only true voice.
Hey folks, welcome to another edition of Reading with Jett. Today we'll be covering the Frankfurt School out of Kevin McDonald's book Culture of Critique. Now we're going to be doing this in separate parts because the Frankfurt School needs you guys need to understand what it was and how it influences what goes on today. The key Jews in the Frankfurt School are T.W. Adorno, Max Horkheimer. We have Erich Fromm until he gets exiled because on a very small matter he disagreed with the Frankfurt School. We have Wilhelm Reich, he was a nutcase who brought in anti-Semitism relating to every scientific study. Now the Frankfurt School received funding from a lot of Jews. One of them was Felix Weil, Felix Weil, I don't know how you say it, Felix Weil, he was a Jew, he funded them. The book, The Authoritarian Personality, which was a key work by the Frankfurt School, was sponsored specifically by the Department of Scientific Research of the American Jewish Community. Now, the Frankfurt School developed in Germany. It was a building at one time, and with the rise of Hitler, they were forced to immigrate their people and works to America. And the main thesis here is the Frankfurt schools essentially, if you wanted to ask certain questions, they could be anti-Semitic, and that's where the study and the topic of discussion would just end there. They also took a Freudian approach to the matters of the nuclear family. They thought whites were very, if you believed in the nuclear family unit, and you were a nutcase, you had a mental illness. What are some other things? Let's see. The biggest thing about them was they introduced individualism into society, while at the same time, promoting collectivism for the Jews. So that is, they told whites, go do your own thing. Don't have, political groups or any kind of groups. Don't have any nationalism. But they said, hey, Jews, what's good for us? Let's do it. So the Frankfurt School was very, and still today, influential in society. So folks, let's get to it. This is Chapter 5, the Frankfurt School of Social Research and the Pathologization of Gentile Group Allegiances. The political agenda of the Frankfurt School of Social Research. This is a quote from Illuminations, a book by Walter Benjamin. Hatred and the spirit of sacrifice are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of liberated grandchildren. It also has here by T.W. Adorno from a book in 1967. To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. That's how that's how this chapter begins. And here's McDonald. Chapters 2 and 4 reviewed several strands of theory and research by Jewish social scientists that appear to have been influenced by specifically Jewish political interests. This theme is continued in the present chapter with a review of The Authoritarian Personality. This classic work in social psychology was sponsored by the Department of Scientific Research of the American Jewish Community. In a series entitled Studies in Prejudice. Studies in Prejudice was closely connected with the so-called Frankfurt School of predominantly Jewish intellectuals associated with the Institute for Social Research, originating during the Weimar period in Germany. That's the period before Hitler came to power. The first generation of the Frankfurt School were all Jews by ethnic background, and the Institute of Social Research itself was funded by a Jewish millionaire, Felix Weil, W-E-I-L. Wheel's efforts as a, quote, patron of the left were extraordinarily successful. By the early 1930s, the University of Frankfurt had become a bastion of the academic left and, quote, the place where all the thinking of interest in the area of social theory was concentrated, unquote. During this period, sociology was referred to as a Jewish science, and the Nazis came to view Frankfurt itself as, quote, a New Jerusalem on the Franconian Jordan, unquote. The Nazis perceived the Institute of Social Research as a communist organization and closed it within 6 weeks of Hitler's ascent to power because it had, quote, encouraged activities hostile to the state, unquote. Even after the immigration of the Institute to the United States, it was widely perceived as a communist front organization with a dogmatic and biased Marxist perspective, and there was a constant balancing act to attempt not to betray the left, quote, while simultaneously defending themselves against corresponding suspicions. That would be suspicions of communism, Marxism, Jewish, being Jews. Gershom Scholem, the Israeli theologian and religious historian, termed the Frankfurt School, quote, a Jewish sect, unquote, and there is good evidence for very strong Jewish identifications of many members of the school. Studies in Prejudice was under the general editorship of Max Horkheimer, a director of the Institute. Horkheimer was a highly charismatic, quote, managerial scholar who constantly reminded his associates of the fact that they belonged to a chosen few in whose hands the further development of theory lay. Horkheimer had a strong Jewish identity that became increasingly apparent in his later writings. However, Horkheimer's commitment to Judaism, as evidenced by the presence of specifically Jewish religious themes, was apparent even in his writings as an adolescent and as a young adult. So he was a Jewish radical from a very young age. At the end of his life, Horkheimer completely accepted his Jewish identification and achieved a grand synthesis between Judaism and critical theory. Critical theory is the name applied to the theoretical perspective of the Frankfurt School. As an indication of Horkheimer's profound sense of Jewish identity, he stated that the goal of philosophy must be to vindicate Jewish history. So basically revise Jewish history. Quote, the anonymous martyrs of the concentration camps are the symbols of humanity that is striving to be born. The task of philosophy is to translate what they have done into language that will be heard, even though their finite voices have been silenced by tyranny. So that's Horkheimer referring to the Auschwitz and other work camp inmates, and tyranny, of course, referring to Nazis. Tarr, an author, describes Horkheimer's inspiration as deriving from his attempt to leave behind Judaism while nevertheless remaining tied to the faith of his fathers. Not surprisingly, there is an alienation and estrangement from German culture. So Jews cannot assimilate with German culture. Here's Horkheimer. Quote, had I just arrived from my homeland of Palestine and in an amazingly short time mastered the rudiments of writing in German, this essay could not have been more difficult to write. The style here does not bear the mark of a facile genius. I tried to communicate with the help of what I read and heard, subconsciously assembling fragments of a language that springs from a strange mentality. What else can a stranger do? But my strong will prevailed because my message deserves to be said, regardless of its stylistic shortcomings. That's the end of Horkheimer's quote. It comes from his book, My Political Confession. Or it's from Tarr's book, but Horkheimer's quoted in that. But basically that quote is anti-German, and Horkheimer basically is saying, I don't know what goys are very weird to me. T.W. Adorno, the first author of the famous Berkeley Studies of Authoritarian Personality reviewed here, was also a director of the Institute, and he had a very close professional relationship with Horkheimer, to the point that Horkheimer wrote of their work, quote, "It would be difficult to say which of the ideas originated in his mind and which in my own. Our philosophy is one," unquote. Jewish themes became increasingly prominent in Adorno's writings beginning in 1940 as a reaction to Nazi anti-Semitism. Indeed, much of Adorno's later work may be viewed as a reaction to the Holocaust, as specified by his famous comment that, quote, "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric," unquote. And his question, quote, "Whether after Auschwitz you can go on living, especially whether one who escaped by accident, one who by right should have been killed," unquote. Tarr notes that the point of the former comment is that, quote, "No study of sociology could be possible without reflecting on Auschwitz and without concerning oneself with preventing new Auschwitzes," unquote. So basically the Jews, like, well, I don't know if Adorno's a Jew. Well, he is a Jew, I think. They basically, regardless of not, they want to make the Holocaust basically the new religion. Everything in the 21st and 20th, everything in history after the Holocaust has to be viewed as never allowing the Holocaust to happen again. And that prevents certain, even scientific theories from even being examined because of the Holocaust. Quote, "The experience of Auschwitz was turned into an absolute historical and sociological category," unquote. Clearly there was an intense Jewish consciousness and commitment to Judaism among those most responsible for these studies. In Chapter 1, it was noted that since the Enlightenment, many Jewish intellectuals have participated in the radical criticism of Gentile culture. Horkheimer very self-consciously perceived an intimate link between Jewish assimilation and the criticism of Gentile society, stating on one occasion that, quote, "Assimilation and criticism are but two moments in the same process of emancipation," unquote. A consistent theme of Horkheimer and Adorno's critical theory was the transformation of society according to moral principles. That's basically what I just said. Everything is viewed in morals now, Jewish morals. From the beginning, there was a rejection of value-free social science research in favor of the fundamental priority of a moral perspective in which present societies, including capitalist, fascist, and eventually Stalinistic societies, were to be transformed into utopias of cultural pluralism. Indeed, long before Studies in Prejudice, critical theory developed the idea that positive, i.e. empirically oriented science, was an aspect of domination and oppression. So science doesn't matter. It can be oppressive. That's the point the Holocaust makes. Horkheimer wrote in 1937 that, quote, "If science as a whole follows the lead of empiricism and the intellect renounces its insistent and confident probing of the tangled brush of observations in order to unearth more about the world than even our well-meaning daily press, it will be participating passively in the maintenance of universal injustice," unquote. The social scientist must therefore be a critic of culture and adopt an attitude of resistance toward contemporary societies. The unscientific nature of the enterprise can also be seen in its handling of dissent within the ranks of the Institute. Writing approvingly of Walter Benjamin's work, Adorno stated, quote, "I have come to be convinced that his work will contain nothing which could not be defended from the point of view of dialectical materialism," unquote. Erich Fromm was exiled from the movement, that would be the Frankfurt School of Research, in the 1930s because his leftist humanism was not compatible with the leftist authoritarianism that was an integral part of the current Horkheimer-Adorno line. Quote, Fromm takes the easy way out with the concept of authority, without which, after all, neither Lenin's avant-garde nor dictatorship can be conceived of. I would strongly advise him to read Lenin. I must tell you that I see a real threat in this article, that's referring to Adorno, or excuse me, Fromm's article. I see a real threat in this article to the line which the journal takes. That's from Adorno. Fromm was exiled from the Institute despite the fact that his position was among the most radically leftist to emerge from the psychoanalytical camp. Throughout his career, Fromm remained the embodiment of psychoanalytical left and its view that bourgeois capitalist society and fascism resulted from gross distortions of human nature. Similarly, Herbert Marcuse was excluded when his orthodox Marxist views began to diverge from the evolving ideology of Adorno and Horkheimer. These exclusionary trends are also apparent in the aborted plans to reinstitute the Institute's journal in the 1950s. It was decided that there were too few contributors with the Horkheimer-Adorno line to support a journal, and the plans ceased. Throughout its history, to be a member of the Institute was to adopt a certain view and to submit to heavy editing and even censorship of one's work to ensure conformity to a clearly articulated ideological position. As might be expected from a highly authoritarian political movement, the result was speculative, philosophical body of work that ultimately had no influence on empirically oriented sociology, so no scientific. It was not compatible with science. Although, as indicated below, it had a profound influence on theory in the humanities. This body of work does not qualify as science because of its rejection of experimentation, quantification, and verification, and because of the priority and moral and political concerns over the investigation of the nature of human social psychology. The priority of the moral and political agenda of critical theory is essential to understanding the Frankfurt School and its influence. Horkheimer and Adorno eventually rejected the classical Marxist perspective on the importance of class struggle for the development of fascism in favor of a perspective in which both fascism and capitalism were fundamentally conceptualized as involving domination and authoritarianism. Further, they developed the theory that disturbed parent-child relations involving the suppression of human nature were a necessary condition for domination and authoritarianism. Obviously, this is a perspective that is highly compatible with psychoanalytical theory, and indeed, psychoanalysis was a basic influence on their thinking. Virtually from the beginning, psychoanalysis had a respected position within the Institute for Social Research, particularly under the influence of Erich Fromm. Fromm held positions at the Frankfurt Psychoanalytical Institution, as well as at the Institute for Social Research, and along with other left Freudians, such as Wilhelm Reich, and eventually Marcuse, he developed theories that incorporated both Marxism and psychoanalysis, essentially by developing a theoretical link between the repression of instincts in the context of family relationships, or, as in the case of Fromm, the development of sadomasochist and anal personality traits, that's anal, A-N-A-L, anal personality traits within the family, and the development of oppressive social economic structures. Now, about Wilhelm Reich, he is one of the guys who came up with anti-Semitism and, using it at every possible juncture. But there's also interesting things about Wilhelm Reich. I'm going to read this here from his Wikipedia. Reich was living in Germany when Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933. On March 2nd, the Nazi newspaper Volksfreie Beobachter published an attack on one of Reich's pamphlet. This pamphlet was The Sexual Struggle of Youth. He left immediately for Vienna, then Scandinavia, moving to the United States in 1939. In 1947, following a series of articles about Oregon in the New Republic and Harper's, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration obtained an injunction against the interstate sale of Oregon accumulators. Charged with contempt for violating it, Reich conducted his own defense, which involved sending the judge all his books to read and arguing that a court was no place to decide matters of science. Reich was sentenced to 2 years in prison. This is in America. And in August 1956, several tons of his publications were burned by the FDA. He died a year later in jail. Now, what Reich did was he essentially published books similar to Freud where, everything stems from your childhood, sexual oppressiveness, and just disgusting and untrue theories. And I really am glad they burned his book, and I have no tears that he died in jail. This is back to the Frankfurt School from Culture of Critique. It is interesting that although the Horkheimer group developed a very strong hostility to empirical science and the positivistic philosophy of science, they felt no need to abandon psychoanalysis. Indeed, psychoanalysis was, quote, a central factor in giving Horkheimer and the most important of his fellow theoreticians the sense that important insights could also be achieved, or even better achieved, by skipping over the specialized disciplines, unquote. We shall see that psychoanalysis as a non-empirically based structure, which nevertheless masqueraded as a science, so it's not based on science and it's masquerading as a science, turned out to be an infinitely plastic tool in the hands of those constructing a theory aimed at achieving purely political objectives, i.e. Jews. For Horkheimer and Adorno, the fundamental shift from the sociological to the psychological level that occurred during the 1940s was motivated by the fact that in Germany, the proletariat had succumbed to fascism, and in the Soviet Union, socialism had not prevented the development of an authoritarian government that failed to guarantee individual autonomy or Jewish group interests. Within the new perspective, authoritarianism was viewed as the fundamental problem. Its origin traceable to family interactions. We were talking about Wilhelm Reich earlier. Traceable to family interactions and ultimately to the suppression of human nature. Nevertheless, the formal outline of the theory can be seen in the philosophical form in the earlier work, Studies on Authority and the Family of 1936, a work that presented from psychoanalytical theory of authoritarian sadomasochist family relationships and their putative linkages with the bourgeois capitalism and fascism. This philosophical speculative approach to anti-Semitism was refined in the chapter on anti-Semitism in Horkheimer and Adorno's, this was published in 1994 and then republished in 1999, Dialect of Enlightenment. In addition to being highly abstract and written in what might be termed a Hegelian manner, the style of writing is assertional. Statements about anti-Semitism are simply asserted with no attempt to provide any empirical justification. So they're saying people hate Jews for no reason. As Jacob Katz, K-A-T-Z, notes, the Frankfurt School has, quote, As Jacob Katz notes, the Frankfurt School has, quote, not been notable for the accuracy of its evaluation of the Jewish situation either before the advent of Nazism or afterward, unquote. However, many of the ideas simply asserted there in a philosophical speculative manner are identical to the theories of anti-Semitism contained in The Authoritarian Personality. Indeed, the authors viewed the chapter on anti-Semitism as a theoretical study for their anticipated empirical study of anti-Semitism. The authoritarian personality may thus be viewed as an attempt to provide these philosophical theories of anti-Semitism with empirical support, but the theory itself was fundamentally an a priori philosophical theory and was not viewed by its authors as subject to either verification or falsification. Quote, Horkheimer seemed to consider the dialects project and the anti-Semitism project as two distinct items relating to one another in the way that an abstract theory relates to its application to a concrete topic, or in the way that Hegel's logic relates to the Hegelian philosophies of history, law, or aesthetics. Was this not a turning distinction within the theoretical and empirical research process into a distinction which silently gave the theory that dignity of speculation and made it independent of empiricism appropriate to science? And was empirical research not thus being denied its status as a dimension of reflected experience and degraded into a means of illustrating the theory? A further open question was whether their enthusiasm for the theory and their contemptuous remarks about research in a specific scientific disciplines in fact represented more than mere evidence of personal values and moods. Whether these did not have an influence on the way in which their scholarly work was carried out and on its results, particularly when external influences were forcing them to take both dimensions seriously. That is from a book by Wiggershaus. The non-empirical nature of the theory of anti-Semitism was quite clear to Adorno as well. Quote, we never regarded the theory simply as a set of hypotheses, but as in some sense standing on its own feet, and therefore did not intend to prove or disprove the theory through our findings, but only to derive from it concrete questions for investigation, which must then be judged on their own merit and demonstrate certain prevalent socio-psychological structures, unquote. That's Adorno on anti-Semitism. Basically, he wasn't interested in why anti-Semitism came about. He just wanted to know the effects it would have. Fundamentally, the authoritarian personality studies results from a felt need to develop an empirical program of research that would support a politically and intellectually satisfying a priori theory of anti-Semitism in order to influence an American academic audience. As Horkheimer stated in 1943, quote, when we became aware that a few of our American friends expected of an Institute of Social Sciences that it engage in studies on pertinent social problems, fieldwork, and other empirical investigations, we tried to satisfy these demands as well as we could, but our heart was set on individual studies in the sense of Geisteswissenschaften, which is German for the humanities, and the philosophical analysis of culture, unquote. Indeed, the goal of producing political propaganda by using the methods of social science was self-consciously articulated by Horkheimer. Thus, Horkheimer reacted with enthusiasm to the idea of including criminals in the study. Research, quote, research would be able here to transform itself directly into propaganda, i.e., if it could be reliably established that a particularly high percentage of criminals were extreme anti-Semites, the result would, as such, already be propaganda. I would also like to try to examine psychopaths in mental hospitals. That's Horkheimer. Both groups were eventually included in the study. A general theme in Dialect of Enlightenment is that anti-Semitism is the result of, quote, the will to destroy born of a false social order, unquote. The ideology that Jews possess a variety of negative traits is simply a projection resulting in a self-portrait of the anti-Semite. Anti-Semites accuse the Jews of wanting power, but in reality, the anti-Semites, quote, long for total possession and unlimited power at any price. They transfer their guilt for this to the Jews, unquote. That's from Dialect of Enlightenment, a Frankfurt book. There is a recognition that anti-Semitism is associated with Gentile movements for national cohesiveness. The anti-Semitism arising along with such movements is interpreted as resulting from the, quote, urge to destroy carried out by mobs that are ultimately manipulated by ruling Gentile elites to conceal their own economic domination. This is what the Jews think now. Anti-Semitism is without personality. Anti-Semitism is without function except to serve as a means of discharging the anger of those who are frustrated economically and sexually. So we even see Horkheimer and Adorno kind of taking that Freud role, where if you're an anti-Semite, you're sexually disturbed and you're a nutcase, and the usual things you hear. Horkheimer and Adorno proposed that modern fascism is basically the same as traditional Christianity because both involve opposition to and subjugation of nature, while Judaism remained a, quote, natural religion, unquote, concerned with national life and self-preservation. Christianity turned toward domination and a rejection of all that is natural. In an argument reminiscent of Freud's argument in Moses and monotheism, religious anti-Semitism then arises because of hatred of those, quote, who did not make the dual sacrifice of reason. The adherents of the religion of the Father and of the Father are hated by those who support the religion of the Son, hated as those who know better, unquote. That's Freud. This tendency to interpret anti-Semitism as fundamentally deriving from suppressing nature is central to the book Studies in Prejudice, and particularly the authoritarian personality. Suppression of nature results in projection of qualities of self onto the environment, and particularly onto the Jews. Quote, impulses which the subject will not admit as his own, even though they are most assuredly so, are attributed to the object, the prospective victim, unquote. Particularly important for this projection process are sexual impulses. Quote, the same sexual impulses which the human species suppressed have survived and prevailed in individuals and in nations, by the way of the mental conversion of the ambient world into a diabolical system, unquote. Christian self-denial, and in particular the suppression of sex result in evil and anti-Semitism via projection. Psychoanalytical theory is invoked as an explanation of this process in a manner that, in its emphasis on suppressed hatred for the Father, also anticipates the theory utilized in the authoritarian personality. Aggressive urges originating in the id are projected onto the external world by actions of the superego. Quote, the forbidden action which is converted into aggression is generally homosexual in nature. Through fears of castration, obedience to the father is taken to the extreme of an anticipation of castration. In conscious emotional approximation to the nature of a small girl, and actual hatred to the father is suppressed. Unquote. That's Freud's Oedipus complex, which is basically, and it's not true for whites. That's why he's a fraud. But that may be how Jews think. But basically, the Oedipus complex is that your father, you hate him, and you're afraid he's going to actually cut your penis off. And the reason you hate your father is Freud says you really want to fuck your mother. Want to have sex with your mother. These Jews are just disgusting, and really no one thinks like that except Jews. And the thing is, when kids go to high school or college, they're told no one takes Freud seriously anymore. He's been disproven. But even though Freud's not talked about in the book, everything around you, people, it's Freud. It's Freud. Okay, everything is Freud. The TV with Tila Tequila Shot of Love, as we posted about the bisexuals, everything stems from Freud. Pretty much all the corruption, the sexual corruption, is based on Freud, especially this ridiculous Oedipus complex. Forbidden actions underlain by powerful instincts are thus turned into aggression, which is then projected onto victims in the external world, with the result that, quote, he attacks other individuals in envy or persecution, just as the repressed bestialist hunts or torments an animal, unquote. A later passage decries the, quote, suppression of animal nature into scientific methods of controlling nature, unquote. Domination of nature, viewed as central to Christianity and fascism, thus derives ultimately from suppressing our animal nature. Horkheimer and Adorno then attempt to explain the role of conformity in fascism. They argue that cohesive Gentile group strategies are fundamentally based on a distortion of human nature, a central theme of the authoritarian personality. Their position is a natural, non-conforming, reflective self in opposition to society that has been corrupted by capitalism or fascism. The development of large industrial interests and the culture industry of late capitalism have destroyed in most people the inner directed reflective power that can produce, quote, self-comprehending guilt, unquote, which could oppose the forces leading to anti-Semitism. This inner directed reflection was emancipated from society and even directed against society. But under the above-mentioned forces, that's Horkheimer and Adorno, it conforms blindly to the values of the external society. Thus humans are portrayed as naturally opposed to the conformity demanded by a higher cohesive society. As indicated below, a consistent theme of the authoritarian personality is the best that Gentile participation in a cohesive groups with high levels of social conformity is pathological, whereas similar behavior of Jews with respect to the group cohesiveness characteristic of Judaism is ignored. Indeed, we have seen that Judaism is portrayed in the dialect of enlightenment as morally superior to Christianity. Which is a joke because the Talmud is essentially just, it's not a religious book. It's a book about opinions on opinions on opinions. Jews just debate stuff. And the morally superior to Christianity, the Talmud is nothing more than a book on how to cheat non-Jews. The Gentile elite is then said to take advantage of the situation by directing the projected hostility of the masses into anti-Semitism. Jews are an ideal target for this projected hostility because they represent all that is antithetical to the totalitarianism. Quote, happiness without power, wages without work, a home without frontiers, religion without myth. These characteristics are hated by the rulers because they ruled secretly long to possess them. The rulers are only safe as long as the people they rule turn their long for goals into hatred forms of evil, unquote. That's from The Dialect of Enlightenment, another Frankfurt garbage work. The conclusion is that if the rulers in fact allowed the ruled to be like the Jews, there would be a fundamental turning point of history. Quote, this is from The Dialect of Enlightenment. Quote, by overcoming that sickness of the mind which thrives on the ground of self-assertion, untainted by reflective thought, mankind would develop from a set of opposing races to the species which, even in nature, is more than mere nature. Individual and social emancipation from domination is the counter-movement to false projection, and no Jew would then resemble the senseless evil visited upon him as upon all persecuted beings, be they animals or men. Again, that's from The Dialect of Enlightenment. The end of anti-Semitism is thus viewed as a precondition for the development of a utopian society and the liberation of humanity. Perhaps the closest that the Frankfurt School ever came to defining utopia. The envisioned utopian society is one in which Judaism can continue as a cohesive group, but in which cohesive nationalistic corporate Gentile groups based on conformity to group norms have been abolished and have been abolished as manifestations of psychopathology. Horkheimer and Adorno developed the view that the unique role of Judaism in world history was to vindicate the concept of difference against the homogenizing forces thought to represent the essence of Western civilization. Quote, the Jews became the metaphoric equivalent of that remnant of society preserving negation and the non-identical, unquote. That is from J. Judaism thus represents the antithesis of Western universalism, the continuation and acceptance of Jewish particularism becomes a precondition for the development of a utopian society of the future. Within this perspective, the roots of anti-Semitism are therefore to be sought in individual psychopathology, not in the behavior of Jews. Nevertheless, there is some acknowledgement that the actual characteristic of Jews may be involved in historical anti-Semitism. But Horkheimer and Adorno theorized that the Jewish characteristics that have led to anti-Semitism were forced on Jews. So basically, Horkheimer and Adorno are saying Jews, people don't dislike Jews for their actions. They were forced on them by, I think, as Horkheimer and Adorno said earlier, the noblemen and stuff like that, it's not true. People dislike Jews based on their action. That's why they've been thrown out of many countries, most notably Spain and Portugal. Jews are said to have incurred the wrath of the lower classes because Jews were the originators of capitalism. Quote, for the sake of economic progress, which is now proving their downfall, the Jews were always a thorn in the side of the craftsmen and peasants who were declassed by capitalism. They are now experiencing to their own cost the exclusive particularist character of capitalism, unquote. However, this Jewish role is viewed as forced on the Jews, who were completely dependent on Gentile elites for their rights, even into the 19th century. Under these circumstances, quote, commerce is not their vocation, it is their fate, unquote. The success of the Jews then constituted a trauma to the Gentile bourgeoisie, quote, who had to pretend to be creative, unquote. Their anti-Semitism is thus, quote, self-hatred, the bad conscience of the parasite, unquote. What Horkheimer and Adorno are doing here is they're trying to cover up and say that Jews were forced into finance because that was the only position available to them, and everyone was anti-Semitic against them. They couldn't get jobs. That's not true. As we saw in reading with Jett, Jews had extensive transatlantic trading commerce since the 16th to 1700s, and Jews always were listed as merchants, even back then, as they are today. I don't know. I don't know of any Jewish laborers. They're almost always merchants or paper pushers. So this is Adorno and Horkheimer trying to cover up that Jews are, very influential in commerce, and that they created capitalism. There are indications that the original anti-Semitism project envisioned a more elaborate discussion of, quote, Jewish character traits that led to anti-Semitism along with suggested methods for overcoming them. However, quote, the topic never became part of the Institute's program, perhaps partly out of consideration for the sensitivity of most Jews towards this topic, and partly to avoid exposing the Institute to the accusation that it was turning the problem of anti-Semitism into a Jewish problem. That is from Wiggerhaus. Indeed, the Institute was well aware of a 1945 Jewish Labor Committee survey of working-class Americans in which the later complained, the working-class Americans, complained of Jewish behaviors related to the types of actual dealings working class individuals would be likely to have with Jews. Adorno appears to have believed that these attitudes were, quote, less irrational than the anti-Semitism of other classes. McDonald has noted that a powerful tendency in both radical politics and psychoanalysis has been a thoroughgoing critique of Gentile society. An important theme here is that studies in prejudice, and especially the authoritarian personality, those are the two works by the Frankfurt School, attempt to show that Gentile group affiliations, and particularly membership in Christian religious sects, Gentile nationalism, and close family relationships are an indication of psychiatric disorder. At a deep level, the work of the Frankfurt School is addressed to altering Western societies in an attempt to make them resistant to anti-Semitism by pathologizing Gentile group affiliations. And because this effort ultimately eschews the leftist solutions that have attracted so many 20th century Jewish intellectuals, it is an effort that remains highly relevant to the current post-communist intellectual and political context. So basically there is that the two works by Horkheimer and Adorno of the Frankfurt School, and there's others involved, Wilhelm Reich and others, they thought that Christianity was horrible, that family was wrong, that nationalism is bad. Basically, they just took the Jewish position on everything. And it's just outrageous. The opposition of Jewish intellectuals to cohesive Gentile groups and a homogeneous Gentile culture has perhaps not been sufficiently emphasized. McDonald has noted in Chapter 1, that is the on our site we listed as Jews 101, but is the Introduction and Theory of Culture Critique, that the conversos were Jews who converted to Christianity, but as we read in Reading with Jett, Jews in America, they always practiced the Talmud. They never ever really became Christians. That the conversos were vastly overrepresented among the humanist thinkers in 15th and 16th century Spain, who opposed the corporate nature of Spanish society centered around the Christian religion. That would be the Catholic Church. McDonald has also noted that a central thrust of Freud's work was to continue to strongly identify as a Jew, while at the same time developing a theory of Christian religious affiliation in which the later is conceptualized as fulfilling infantile needs. So basically that's Freud is perverting Christianity. Similarly, another way of conceptualizing the Jewish advocacy of radical political movements consists with the material in Chapter 3. We did not cover that yet, but that is Jews in the left. Is that these political movements may be understood as simultaneously undermining Gentile intra-societal group affiliations such as Christianity and nationalism, at the same time allowing for the continuation of Jewish identification. I mean, that's exactly true. Jews hate nation states, they hate Christianity, but they want Israel to be basically a racist state, and they love their Judaism, or their Talmud. For example, Jewish communists consistently opposed Polish nationalist aspirations, and after they came to power in the post-World War II era, they liquidated Polish nationalists and undermined the role of the Catholic Church, while simultaneously establishing secular Jewish economic and social structures. It is of some historical interest to note that an important feature of the rhetoric of German anti-Semites throughout the 19th century into the Weimar period. That was the period before Hitler came to power. Into the Weimar period was that Jews advocated political forms such as liberalism, which opposed structuring society as a highly cohesive group. At the same time, they themselves retained an extraordinary group cohesiveness that enabled them to dominate Germans. So basically, Jews are like, they're hypocrites. That's what they are. They're hypocrites. They're telling the Germans to, separate and mingle, but they're not doing that. The Jews aren't doing that. So they're hypocrites. During the Weimar period, the Nazi propagandist Alfred Rosenberg complained that Jews advocated a completely atomatized society, that's central society, while at the same time exempting themselves from this process. Whereas the rest of society was to be prevented from participating in highly cohesive groups, the Jews, quote, would retain their international cohesiveness, blood ties, and spiritual unity. That's from, In Mein Kampf, Hitler clearly believed that Jewish advocacy of liberal attitudes was a deception, overlaying a commitment to racialism and a highly cohesive group strategy. Quote, while the Jew seems to overflow with enlightenment, progress, freedom, humanity, he himself, Hitler's referring to the Jew, he himself practices the severest segregation of his race. Unquote. That's Hitler from Mein Kampf. The conflict between Jewish advocacy of Enlightenment ideals and actual Jewish behavior was noted by Klein. Quote, annoyed by the parochial attachments of other people and unreceptive to the idea of a pluralistic state, many non-Jews interpreted that Jewish assertion of pride as a subversion of the enlightened or egalitarian state. The Jewish stress on national or racial pride reinforced the non-Jewish perception of the Jew as a disruptive social force. Unquote. Again, that is by Klein. Ringer, that's an author, also notes that a common component of anti-Semitism among academics during the Weimar period was a perception that Jews attempted to undermine patriotic commitment and social cohesion of society. Indeed, the perception that Jewish critical analysis of Gentile society was aimed at dissolving the bonds of cohesiveness within the society was common among educated Gentile Germans, including university professors. One academic referred to the Jews as, quote, the classic party of national decomposition, unquote. That's basically saying they're parasites. In the event, National Socialism developed as a cohesive Gentile group strategy in opposition to Judaism, a strategy that completely rejected the Enlightenment ideal of an automatized society based on individual rights in opposition to the state. As McDonald has argued in Separation and Its Discontents, in this regard, National Socialism was very much like Judaism, which has been throughout its... by the way, that's Judaism as a political movement, not a theological version. Which has been throughout its history fundamentally a group phenomenon in which the rights of the individual have been submerged in the interests of the group. The greatest example of that would be Jews killing other Jews to get Jews to migrate to Israel. That's a tongue twister there, isn't it? Jews. As evident in the material reviewed here and in the previous chapters, at least some influential Jewish social scientists and intellectuals have attempted to undermine Gentile groups' strategies while leaving open the possibility that Judaism continue as a highly cohesive group strategy. So again, they're being hypocrites. This theme is highly compatible with the Frankfurt School consistent rejection of all forms of nationalism. The result is that in the end, the ideology of the Frankfurt School may be described as a form of radical individualism that nevertheless despised capitalism, and in individualism in which all forms of Gentile collectivism and condemned as an indication of social or individual pathology. Thus, in Horkheimer's essay on German Jews, the true enemy of the Jews is Gentile collectives of any kind, and especially nationalism. That's, Gentiles as a group. Although no mention is made of the collectivist nature of Judaism, Zionism, or Israeli nationalism, the collectivist tendencies of modern Gentile society are deplored, especially fascism and communism. The perception for Gentile society is radical individualism and the acceptance of pluralism. People have an inherent right to be different from others and to be accepted by others as different. Indeed, to be differentiated from others is to achieve the highest level of humanity. The result is that, quote, no party and no movement, neither the old left nor the new, indeed no collectivity of any sort was on the side of truth. The residue of the forces of truth, of true change, was located in the critical individual alone, unquote. That's from a book by Mayer. As a correlate of this thesis, Adorno adopted the idea that the basic role of philosophy is the negative role of resisting attempts to endow the world with any universality, objectivity, or totality, that is, with a single organizing principle for society that would homogeneize society because it applied to all humans. In negative dialectics, the main example attacked by Adorno is Hegel's idea of universal history. But a similar argument applies to any ideology, such as nationalism, that results in a sense of national or pan-human universality. For example, the principle of exchange characteristic of capitalism is rejected because through it all humans become consumable and thus lose their unique particularity. Science too is condemned because of its tendency to seek universal principles of reality and its tendency to look for quantitative commensurable differences between humans rather than qualitative differences. So basically, the Frankfurt School or Adorno, they don't believe in objectivity or totality. They don't believe in basically science because, as we learned earlier, it could be anti-Semitic. Each object, quote, should be respected in its ungeneralized historical uniqueness, unquote. Or, as Adorno himself noted in Minima Moralia, quote, in the face of the totalitarian unison with which the eradication of difference is proclaimed as a purpose in itself, even part of the social force of liberation may have temporarily withdrawn to the individual sphere, unquote. In the end, the only criterion for a better society was that it be one in which, quote, one can be different without fear, unquote. So multiculturalism, that you could be any race, and the Jews get more radical with this, with the transgender, homosexual agenda, and that's encouraging people to be different. This is where it stems from. The former communist had become an advocate of radical individualism, at least for the Gentiles. As discussed in Chapter 4, Erich Fromm, another member of the Frankfurt School until he was excluded, also recognized the utility of individualism as a prescription for Gentile society, while nevertheless remaining strongly identified as a Jew. Fromm was kicked out basically because he he had a disagreement with the Jews at Frankfurt, and that just shows that the Frankfurt School, those Jews, Adorno and Horkheimer, had a set agenda. They wanted to go a certain way, and if you differed with them on anything, even if it was still pro-Jewish in nature, you were kicked out, like Fromm was. Congruent with this stress on individualism and the glorification of difference, Adorno embraced a radical form of philosophical skepticism, which is completely incompatible with the entire social science enterprise of the authoritarian personality. That was the original work funded by the American Jewish Congress, or Committee, by the Frankfurt School. Indeed, Adorno rejected even the possibility of ontology or reification because he viewed the contrary positions as ultimately supporting totalitarianism. Given Adorno's preoccupation with Jewish issues and strong Jewish identity, it is reasonable to suppose that these ideological structures are intended to serve as a justification of Jewish particularism. In this view, Judaism, like any other historical particular entity, must remain beyond the reach of science forever, incomprehensible in its uniqueness and ever in opposition to all attempts to develop homogeneous social structures in the society as a whole. However, its continued existence is guaranteed as an a priori moral imperative. So basically, if you ask any questions about the development of Judaism, you are an anti-Semite thanks to these Frankfurt Jews. The prescription that Gentile society adopt a social organization based on radical individualism would indeed be an excellent strategy for the continuation of Judaism as a cohesive collectivist group strategy. So basically, Jews tell Gentiles, go out, free love, do what you want, be crazy, but they don't tell their own people that. Research summarized by Triendis, that's an author, on cross-cultural differences in individualism and collectivism indicates that anti-Semitism would be lowest in individualistic societies rather than societies that are collectivist and homogeneous apart from Jews. So you could think of National Socialism Germany, where everyone pretty much woke up that day with a purpose, and compared to America, where there's really no purpose to even really wake up. This is the most nihilistic society and consumerist society, thanks to Jews. A theme of McDonald's prior book is that European societies, with the notable exceptions of the National Socialist era in Germany and the medieval period of Christian religious hegemony, both periods of intense anti-Semitism, have been unique among the economically advanced traditional and modern cultures of the world in their commitment to individualism. As McDonald has argued in Separation as Discontents, that's again another work by McDonald, the presence of Judaism as a highly successful and salient group strategy provokes anti-individualist responses from Gentile societies. So the more successful Jews get working as Jews, non-Jews will see this and work together, and that actually is that's all it takes. When whites come together, that's anti-Semitism. Collectivist cultures, collectivist cultures explicitly includes Judaism in this category. Collectivist cultures place a much greater emphasis on the goals and needs of the in-group rather than on individual rights and interests. Collectivist cultures develop an unquestioned attachment to the in-group, including the perception that in-group norms are universally valid. This is a form of ethnocentrism that Jews practice. Automatic obedience to in-group authorities and willingness to fight and die for the in-group. These characteristics are usually associated with distrust of and unwillingness to cooperate with outgroups. That's why Jews do not trust Gentiles. In collectivist cultures, morality is conceptualized as that which benefits the group, and aggression and exploitation of outgroups are acceptable. That's basically the Talmud. That's the synopsis of the Talmud. That in collectivist cultures, morality is conceptualized as that which benefits the group, that would be Jews, and aggression and exploitation of outgroups, that would be whites, are acceptable. That's what the Talmud essentially teaches. It teaches the Jews how to cheat Gentiles, basically. People in individualist cultures, in contrast, show little emotional attachment to in-groups. And this is what the Jews want for us now, and what they have achieved. Individualist cultures, where it's all about you. Personal goals are paramount, and socialization emphasizes the importance of self-reliance, independence, individual responsibility, and finding yourself. Like, that never really, that's just some conjured up shit you see in Jewish Hollywood films so they can make something that actually pushes an agenda. Well, she's gay and she found herself. See, that's the theme now, and in the 60s it was, well, she's marrying a black guy, she found herself. They usually pick on women, but you could say the same. He found an Asian chick, he found himself. He wants to be gay, he found himself. Either way, the rise of all this degeneracy is due to individualist culture. That's why family is decaying. That's why Christianity and other forms of, Christianity is decaying. And this was all what Max Horkheimer and Adorno said earlier, that they wanted individualist society. They wanted to. They said that families, the family unit is essentially, if you like that, you're mentally ill. So Jews are insane, and this enough is enough already. Individualists have more positive attitudes towards strangers and outgroup members, and are more likely to behave in a pro-social, altruistic manner to strangers. This promotes race mixing and, hey, I have a cool black friend. Because they are less aware of in-group, out-group attitudes toward out-group members, they often disagree with in-group policy, show little emotional commitment or loyalty to in-groups, and do not have a sense of common fate with other in-group members. Opposition to outgroup occurs in individualist societies, but the opposition is more, quote, rational, in the sense that there is less of a tendency to suppose that all of the outgroup members are culpable for the misdeeds of a few. So not all people who aren't white nationalists are essentially bad people. That's one way of interpreting that. Individualists form mild attachments to many groups, whereas collectivists have an intense attachment and identification to a few groups. That being the key. Individuals are like, yeah, that group's kind of cool. They're cool. But, take Jews as collectivists. They don't care so much about this group or that group. It's just what's good for the Jews. The expectation is that individualists will tend to be less predisposed to anti-Semitism and more likely to blame any offensive Jewish behavior as resulting from transgression by individual Jews rather than stereotypically true of all Jews. That's true if you ever heard I'm sure everyone has, listeners, there's blacks and there's niggers. That comes from individualism. And, that's not true. Jews generally act. Well, Jews always act as a cheaty, scheming people, and niggers are predisposed to crime, rape, and ma-dick. So it's only because of the Frankfurt individualism that white patriotards usually and liberals think that there's a difference between blacks and niggers, or a beaner and a Mexican, or a kike and a Jew. No, there's not. Okay. No, like a black, you can get them to chimp out. You can get an Uncle Tom nigger to chimp out. Believe me. However, Jews as members of a collectivist subculture living in an individualist society are themselves more likely to view the Jewish-Gentile distinction as extremely salient and to develop stereotypically negative views about Gentiles. In Triandindus, that's the author, not of this, but previous works we've cited. In Triandindus terms, then, the fundamental intellectual difficulty presented by the authoritarian personality is that Judaism itself is a highly collectivist subculture in which authoritarianism and obedience to in-group, that would be the main Jewish core, to in-group norms and the suppression of individual interests for the common good have been of vital importance throughout history. Such attributes in Gentiles tend to result in anti-Semitism because of the social identity process. So basically, when Jews want to do something collective, they have the right to do it, and it's great, and all Jews are for it. When whites try to do it, it's anti-Semitism. And I know I keep repeating myself, but I really got to drive the point home. It's thanks to the Frankfurt School. Jews may, as a result, perceive themselves to have a vital interest in advocating a highly individualist, atomized Gentile culture, while simultaneously maintaining their own highly elaborated collectivist subculture. So, Jews think they have the right to teach the world how to act, and then they also think they can live by other standards. This is the perspective developed by the Frankfurt School and apparent throughout Studies in Prejudice. That was another work by the Frankfurt School. However, we shall see that the authoritarian personality extends beyond the attempt to pathologize cohesive Gentile groups to pathologize adaptive Gentile behavior in general. The principal intellectual difficulty is that behavior that is critical to Judaism as a successful group evolutionary strategy is conceptualized as pathological in Gentiles. So you're a nutcase if you want to do what the Jews do. That's the end of part 1 on the Frankfurt School. This is a very big work, folks. And you can listen to part 2 for the sub-chapter, the review of the authoritarian personality. Thanks for listening.